Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your perennial host or hostess, if we're going to be gender-based on the show, which we never are. Today we've got a really wonderful group of people to talk about an issue I don't think I've seen discussed very fully in our community, and it has to do with something a lot of us take for granted, and that is philanthropy, or maybe that's not even the word for it anymore, checkbook activism. The fact that we raise and give a lot of money, but not all of us do. And the question of whether we need to support our own community, whether anyone else supports our community, why people do it, is the subject matter today. We're calling the show The Culture of Greed and the Culture of Giving. I have three wonderful guests. First, Bill Melamed, who is on the board of directors of the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center and the board of AMFAR, who's a donor and an activist. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Next, Alice Hom, who's a graduate student in history doing her dissertation on activism among lesbians of color. And she's also a board member of the LA Lesbian and Gay Community Fund. Welcome, Alice.
Hi.
And my good and wonderful old friend, Torie, well, not old, long-standing friend, Torie Osborn, who is now the executive director of the Liberty Hill Foundation, former executive director of NGLTF and of the Los Angeles Center, gives the word activism, I mean, they should call it Torieism because of all the work you've done. Welcome, Torie.
Thanks.
Billy, I'd like to start with you, a donor activist. You're a very, very, very generous member of the community, but also generous with your time in terms of going beyond your own sort of contribution mode and raising money, making certain that it's directed to various projects. But a lot of people think that we're a very rich community, but a very selfish community. What is your experience with our community? Are we rich and selfish? Are we very generous? What are we doing?
Well, I think that the topic of the show sort of applies to our community and the greater community, both. And the idea of being selfish and rich, or generous and selfish, seems to be a prevailing problem, I think, sort of in the philanthropic perspective of people in our country anyway. In our community, it feels to me like, and I think it's probably mirrored in the larger community, that there are a number of people who are reliable major donors, and then there's another group of people who, when friends call on them, will write a check for something or will attend a dinner because there's a chic guest or a fun event happening, but don't really necessarily make the connect between what they're doing on Saturday night in a black tie and what the money is going to. And so, in a way, they're giving, but they're doing it for sort of selfish reasons. I can have fun on a Saturday night, I can dress up. And so I think there's a dichotomy that isn't easily resolvable between selfish and rich. I mean, there are a lot of studies that have been done. The gay community has a lot of double income dinks. Thank you. You know, double income, no children households, and so there's money to be spent, and is it spent on travel and gym memberships and nice cars, or is it spent to some extent on helping others who are in need?
Seems to me, though, that a smaller percentage of people in the world, not just in our community, are motivated to give. I mean, it's not a culture that's built into children. You know, your parents say, save money, here's your allowance, put it away. They rarely say, here's your allowance, figure out who you're going to give it to and make the world a better place. How do you think you came to your understanding that this was an important piece of your life?
Well, actually, I credit a couple of people to educating me fairly early on in my adult life. Although my parents, and I grew up in a family where my parents were somewhat involved in charity, and so that there was some cultural identification for that, and frankly I think some of it even is being Jewish. That it seems to be a community that is more identified, or it's more inbred to promote the idea of philanthropic giving. Early on, sort of as a young adult, I crossed paths with Torie actually, and with David Mixner and a few people who really inspired me that if you can devote some of your time and your resources to helping those in need in whatever area it is, whether it's AIDS, as that became a threat to this community, or poverty issues, or education, or children's issues, or the environment, that we're all sort of in this together. And if you have the ability, whether it's time or money, to impact the world and make it a better place, you owe it to yourself as part of the world to do that.
Is it your experience that a lot of people in the gay community, when they are motivated to give, really only want to give to our community? And if so, would that be, is that a good thing? Is that a necessary thing for the community? You know, how does that fit together?
I think it's probably, again, sort of a mixed bag. I certainly think over the last 15 years with the rising up of the AIDS epidemic and crisis, it really brought out a huge number of activist donors and people who realized that no one was going to take care of the sick other than our own, other than ourselves first. And so I think in that area, certainly, there is an inclination to sort of take care of the community first, because as a disenfranchised minority, you can't, you know, the political system fails us, other people fail us, so if we don't take care of ourselves first, who's going to do it? I think that there's a mix now with donors, or with activists, or with givers, in terms of, frankly, less interest in AIDS, just because that's sort of run its donor course, unfortunately, a little bit, but also making a difference in other areas. I still think primarily, probably the majority of the giving is directed within, towards the community.
Why do you think private giving is important? I mean, I know you do. You do it out of your own generosity and because it's something you can do. But I don't know, I actually want to ask all the guests to touch on this when we get to you. There is a notion that all of the money that we raise to do services or to do organizing or whatever we give to is money that really should be allocated by the government. I mean, the government has a responsibility too. Aren't we kind of leaving it sort of randomly to whatever the flavor of the month is in terms of private giving?
I certainly think it's random in terms of what appeals to you, so that could be flavor of the month. But the problem there is that the government's not capable of taking care of everything. And you know, we can go back to why you spend your time in Sacramento fighting the battles you fight, because certain people in the government don't care about certain sectors or issues, and so don't want to allocate government funds. You know, and then it falls, I think, to private foundations and individuals to try to rise up to meet the need where it's visible. And often it becomes flavor of the month because this is a high-profile issue, or has attached a celebrity, or has some panache or cachet that makes it a more appealing place to give your money. And I think one of the things that people in the donor activist community can do is try to come up with some strategies and plans to formulate what are areas of need and where can you make an impactful difference. What areas can be handled by private money that government really should or can't do. I don't know necessarily that the government has a responsibility to take care of every aspect of everybody's lives.
Now, there's different ways that you can also direct your own contributions. I mean, on the board of the center and AMFAR, I mean, that's a major fundraising operation. I don't even know what the center's budget is these days, but I bet it's gabillions.
It's about $25 million a year, which is quite a growth from the days that Torie and I were last involved in the center.
But you also direct your giving, do you not? I mean, there's another aspect of it. I know when we talk about the fund and the foundation, the notion is to gather money and make a grant. And how do you relate to that? Because you've done all those things.
Well, for me, the two boards I serve on sort of allow me to spend my energy raising money from other people, that part of me that does that, about two issues that are very important to me. AIDS research, which is still critical, and the center and the Gay and Lesbian Center, which provides such a panoply of services from youth to legal to housing to education to counseling to medical services, that it becomes, by raising money for that one institution, I'm able to help, you know, a lot of different clients be served, or people in need. In terms of my other personal giving, and one of the reasons I support Torie and the Liberty Hill Foundation is to be able to reach out where there are smaller organizations or grassroots organizations, and I think that becomes the obligation of foundations and philanthropists who want to be educated and directed, where a $1,000 grant to an organization with a couple of $100,000 a year budget or less is a huge difference. It might mean keeping the office open another month. A $1,000 check to a $25 million a year budgeted organization at the center is useful, and those ongoing donors obviously are required to keep the doors open there, but the impact and that you can have with that money is very different.
Alice, I don't know your history with the fund and even how long it's been there, but it's interesting. A woman who's doing her research on activism by lesbians of color, there are a lot of people that would say, you know, what's the connect here?
Right. I think of that all the time myself because I need to write about it, but the fund is the Los Angeles Lesbian and Gay Community Fund, and it's been around for 4 years now, and I came on 3 years ago. And what we've done is give out grants to underserved gay and lesbian organizations in Los Angeles whose services are not necessarily seen as benefiting from other philanthropic organizations. Like, we don't get money. These organizations that can't get money from the California Community Foundation on their own because they're too small, or they're volunteer driven, they don't have a board, so they don't have 501c3. So there are all these different issues that come up with gay and lesbian organizations that don't fit the profile of getting money from foundations or private corporations. So what we've done is, I think we've given out about 30 grants in the last 4 years, ranging from like $1,000 on up to about 15. And what I find really appealing about it is this grant making. We have a reception every year, and we get to see the organizations that give the money, and they talk about their projects, and then they talk about where this money is going to go, and they're just thankful because this $1,000, $5,000, they're going to stretch for a whole year for a project that won't get funded elsewhere, and with the money we see great impact. And one of the organizations that we gave money to in the past few years is Bienestar, and they've always asked for programs to help Latino gay men, bisexual men, and social support, mental health, things like that. And our last gift to them was to help a Latina lesbian and bisexual program. And they would have never done that unless we had given them the first 2 years funding and really think about, okay, co-gender organizing, working with another population. So that's the great thing about it. And what I like to connect my activist work with, and things that I study and things that I educate people on, I feel like activism, money, they all kind of go together in some ways.
But there's been a fear historically, hasn't there been, that, you know, money is such a corrupting force?
Yeah, especially for women.
Yeah, the women say, thank you, I don't want any, and of course the people with money say, great.
Right.
You know, we'll keep it all for ourselves.
Right, and I think that's what I do. I try to tell people that one shouldn't be afraid of money, and women, I think there's a psychological disconnect between what they do in their volunteer work, in their energy, that they do give money, and they have to deal with money, but they're not thinking about it in terms of philanthropy. They're not thinking of it in terms of, oh, I am a donor and I can give money to an organization and support them. Women of color, lesbians of color have been always giving money and giving time and energy, but they don't see it as, you know, in a philanthropic way, because perhaps they just think rich gay white men do that, and I don't do that.
Because philanthropy means big money.
Yeah, it means
one
big money.
check from me.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I've gotten a lot out of the 3 years working with this fund, and like over 9 years ago, I started getting on these boards for different organizations, and I think that's how I got in touch with fundraising. And being a board member also means giving up some of your own money to the organization. Like, I had no idea that that's what one did, and so it was this, you know, learning experience. You know, if you're on a board, there are certain things that you do as a board member, and there are board responsibilities. And since I was a student, have been for a while now, there was always like the sliding scale, but I felt like I also needed to invest not only my time and energy, but my money behind the organization and behind the issue. So in one way or another, either I donated money myself or I was able to raise funds from other people who would, match what I was supposed to give.
It's also easier for organizations that provide services to kind of make an emotional pitch for what they do, and they have people with whom you can connect, etc.
Right.
But I'm not sure whether the fund itself also funds organizing or activism. I mean, certainly as an activist, there's a reason why you're interested in this fund. And does the fund?
It funds a whole range of issues, from social service, from having people. We do arts and culture. We do activist work. We just gave some money to Project 10 for their active voice, having young high school students go to Youth Lobby Day in Sacramento. So we fund things like that. We're not prevented from engaging in political work. That is very much a part of what we're doing, and that's our philosophy behind the fund in some ways, to give money to a wide range, because no one would give money for a political organizing in some ways, except for Liberty Hill. That's what you do. But most foundations don't do that. So yeah, we have given money in for those projects.
Do you find many women who are involved in boards like this, or in foundation or giving like this? Women of color?
Oh yeah. I mean, I have close friends who are part of the LA Women's Foundation and California Endowment, and I know program officers. I have ties with people who are at that level. I don't think of myself at that level, but they're working in these same organizations that I work with, and it's very interesting to see. I think a younger generation see these women who were working in the 70s and 80s and who helped start LA Women's Foundation, who helped start other organizations, and they're moving into the philanthropy world, which I find very interesting, because they started off doing activist work, doing community-based work, and now they're program officers. Now they're heading certain foundations. And I talk to them about that because it's an interest of mine, and they talk about this is where they feel they can make another kind of impact, because money makes the world go round in some ways, and it can help the organization and the issues that they're still, committed to.
Does it help in the organizations not identified as gay and lesbian to sensitize them to our issues when gay and lesbian people, as you indicated, women have move into these other arenas? I mean, do you find that there's more interest or sensitivity to our issues?
I totally think so.
Because we're there?
Yeah, because the Gay and Lesbian Community Fund is really the only queer organization that I'm a part of in that active way. My other community work is with either gender-based or race-based or ethnic-based organizations. And in those groups, I'm talking constantly about queer issues. That's my work, that's a part of me, and they know that I come in with that interconnected philosophy, way of life. I cannot, not be queer or a lesbian in front of them. So, and they know that my work is about that. And they ask me, so what is it that you're doing? What is it that, how can my what I do help you? And what I'm able to do is make those connections, that if it's an Asian American women's organization, Asian American lesbian issues are a part of that already. If it's I volunteer for the Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team. It's the only Asian American AIDS service agency here in Los Angeles. And in some ways they think, okay, what should we do about co-gender issues, because they're more concerned about, Asian American gay men or men who have sex with men and how AIDS affects them. And I tell them, no, you need to really look at gender issues. So we're able to make connections between things that people think are disparate. And I liked what you asked Bill about the gay community and how it's perceived, and I think it's the community is so diverse that it's only certain people get perceived as being able to give a lot of money. Gay men of color or people of color who are queer aren't within that realm of that stereotype in some ways. So.
Right. Well, Torie, transition has been, I mean, this is part of your story of transition too. Spent a lot of your time in the queer community and organizing, and now here you are, the executive director of Liberty Hill Foundation. You should probably, since everybody's mentioned Liberty Hill, and this is a national show, you should probably say a little bit about what it does, but also about what the connection is between the work you're doing now and the work you were doing.
Yeah, it's a through line that I'm not sure is immediately apparent, but Liberty Hill is a foundation, a public charity that funds mostly community organizing, and all of it is social change organizing, progressive work. Mostly small seed grants, $5,000 to $25,000. Lots of economic, racial, social justice organizing over the last couple of decades in LA County. Our area is LA County. We're part of a network of national foundations that do social change work, and we're part of a kind of growing alternative philanthropy movement. The women's funds, Alice mentioned the LA Women's Foundation, the ethnic funds. There's a growing set of foundations that have come, small funds targeted to building and empowering within ethnic and racial minorities, women's community, and the gay and lesbian funds are part of that. Although for the most part they've been housed at more mainstream organizations. Liberty Hill is in the process of actually talking to the Gay and Lesbian Fund about them becoming a part of Liberty Hill Foundation, which I think would be a kind of a neat focus for us. The Liberty Hill is, I mean, I think for me the through line is that we're an activist foundation, that what we're about is building a social change movement or social change movements or empowering people, whether it's on the level of a local campaign for affordable housing or against a slumlord, or whether it's funding an organization that's working with kind of, you know, welfare recipients trying to figure out what to do in this new era, or whether it's funding Fringe Benefits, which is this wonderful, innovative theater group that works in elementary schools, including, I might say, Catholic elementary schools, on issues of homophobia. And kids do these little plays called cootie shots, where they go and they do these really short 5 to 7 minute plays with the kids, and they talk about homophobia, because it starts in elementary school.
Right.
And that's the kind of, you know, innovative, risk-taking, cutting-edge philanthropy that Liberty Hill and some of these alternative funds are able to do, that, including the Gay and Lesbian Fund, that's responsive kind of to the grassroots needs for some fresh solutions, things that start up. I mean, all good ideas, you know, I think, was it Margaret Mead who said that, you know, democracy runs on a few people with a good idea, and what we do is we fund it at the right time. So for me, it's an extension of activism. I mean, our time, our human resources, and our money is all that we've got. And I was thinking, listening to these guys talk, I remember after years and years of doing activist work, I mean, I didn't call it volunteerism because that itself felt too kind of mainstream and stuffy. It was activism and it was street organizing, you know, in the 60s and 70s. After years and years of doing it and being on boards or being on staff, being kind of a professional activist, I remember when I identified as a donor, and it was a turning point. I was always writing checks. They might have been $10 checks, but again, there was this sort of class divide. You weren't really a donor unless you were writing $1,000 checks. And this is what I think this alternative philanthropy movement, the Gay and Lesbian Fund, the Liberty Hill, and this sort of new invigoration of and claiming of philanthropy. And mind you, it's very timely. There's a $10 trillion transfer of wealth that's going to go on basically to our generation. We span a couple of decades here among us, the four of us, but over the next 10 to 20 years, right as many of us are reaching our highest income earning potential. And there's a responsibility, particularly with government devolution, particularly with a growing gap between rich and poor. We've seen an upward transfer of wealth over the last 15 years in this country that's quite extraordinary. You know, the top 1% went from owning 17% of the wealth to almost 45% of the wealth since 1980. And So there's a kind of, I think, a moral obligation to give back in lots of the traditional ways. Again, whether it's activism, whether it's volunteering in those old soup kitchens that need you more than ever, or whether it's writing checks. And for me, I use this as an example, this moment when I realized, wait a minute, I'm not just an activist, whether professional or volunteer, I'm a donor. And there's a kind of a populist, a democratization, I think, of philanthropy that is going on. And again, I think it's mirrored in the larger community, where more and more people are recognizing that part of what you give back in sort of being of service or giving to the community or leaving your legacy, whether it's big bucks or little bucks, is recognizing your responsibility to write checks.
But isn't it true, as a matter of fact, when you and I were talking about this show before, didn't you tell me that it's not the richest people that are giving the highest percentage of their
Right.
income or even the most money? It's sort of folks who are doing well, like you and me, not complaining, but sort of carrying much more of a burden in this giving. Why do you think that is?
There's two things that people need to know. There's a lot of stereotypes flying around. I mean, one of them that's true is over 60%, I think 63% of philanthropy in this country comes from people who make $50,000 or less. That cuts against what we think of. I mean, $50,000 is certainly not poor, but it's not wealthy either in this culture. Second of all, compared to your total, or whether it's your income or your net worth, poor people and middle income people give a far greater proportion than wealthy people do. And so even though more and more wealth, as we said, was being concentrated at the top. And so the original thing that you talked about with the show, sort of how do you create a culture of giving out of a culture of greed? And I don't think you were talking about gay people being greedy. I think you're talking about a culture that's fairly, a broad culture,
largest
that's fairly
culture, right,
materialistic and individualistic, and doesn't instill in people the kind of values that Billy learned from his mentors on this about, part of what is meaningful. It's not just some altruistic thing. It feels great to help build something, and all we've got is our talent and our money. It feels great to give. People say that. It sounds like a truism. It's true. So I think the interesting question is, how do we all help build this culture of giving? How do we, spread the word? How do we model the behavior? Bill Melamed is a model of somebody who, when I first met him, he was on the board of the Women's Building. He was the only man on the board of the LA Women's Building, and I thought that was kind of cool. But he models a donor who is also an activist. He models a donor who also gets out there and does the work. It's, as I say, it's this kind of, we need to make accessible models. It's not the old style philanthropy, which is, sort of blue-haired ladies writing big checks to high art, like the opera. This is about all of us. More middle and low income people actually support, and mostly it's things like the church, that their churches or synagogues that they're supporting. But and I want to say something about the gay community. First of all, women and people of color or people of moderate and low income need to own their donor identity, as we were talking about earlier. I think that's really important. It's important not to constantly replicate this kind of divide between gay men and the rest of us. And second of all, I think we have seen extraordinary times of generosity and of a culture of giving, as I think I called it, in the early part of the AIDS epidemic, when you really saw people, whether it was those lesbians giving blood for gay men they barely ever talked to, or whether it was people building an entire system of health care because the government was genocidally negligent.
Well, you talked about the devolution of government, which is it's an interesting word, and I think that ties to what you just said, if I'm not mistaken. That is, they're sort of in two ways. We would fault the government and have to fill the gaps. One is they have abdicated that which they might have done in the past about social welfare. And the second is they never touched our community in any way to help us. And that's not an unusual thing. We identify health issues in communities of color. We identify toxic school sites, something Liberty Hill knows about, and they say, never mind, or it's not there, or...
Right, but I want to make the point that Billy made earlier, which is that even if we restored activist government, which we would all, I think, be in agreement that the government has been pushed by the far right in this country to take away the safety net and to actually abdicate its responsibility, even to those communities it did serve before, if not well. But I also have to say that it's never going to be enough. There's always going to be a private responsibility. There's always going to be a responsibility of corporations, and I wish they would step up more, of private foundations and of individuals. The government is never going to do it all. So even if we went back to having better, or let's hope they were better this time around, more government programs, there's still going to be a significant role for individuals, especially in this next 20 or 30 years with this transfer of wealth, when people are going to, and you know, it's
when you
not
say
just
transfer wealth, you mean by inheritance?
Yes, by
Right.
inheritance to the baby boomer generation. It comes into $10 billion, and it's the largest transfer of wealth in the history of humanity. And it's at the time when we are, who have actually been affected by the 60s, the first generation coming into money that's been affected by the 60s. It's going to be an interesting thing to see if there is more activist giving, if there is more straight people giving to gay stuff, if there is more, more creativity and more collaboration and more of all the things that we know that work. So, you know, the last thing that I wanted to say, it's something we really believe in at Liberty Hill, is the responsibility of donors to kind of be educated on issues and Billy touched on this, to really know what you're giving to, you know, to do that investigate. You have a more active, a more informed donor community now, and I think we're going to see more and more of this, where evaluation of grant making is more important, where you know, how much of the dollars is going to fundraising and all those kind of traditional questions. What's the real efficacy? What's the bang for the buck? And those are significant questions, and I think they're good questions for donors to ask about gay and lesbian programs.
Well, and it can help too when we think, I know when I write a check to the gay and lesbian whatever, that I think I know that it's going for services that were described in their little brochure. When I give money, though, to a foundation where I need to know, like the Women's Foundation or the, you know, or Liberty Hill, then I see that it goes to lots of different things, but I don't know what it's going to go to next year. So to some extent, it's kind of a leap of faith about approach, especially, I think, in empowerment work like
community
this.
Organizing,
Yeah.
Public education. Yeah, you got to. But it's like any other organization. You're believing in, you're investing in vision, leadership, a certain amount of fiscal responsibility, a sense it's going to be a going concern. The money's well spent. That there's some internal evaluation process. But you're believing in the people that are doing the good work. And for foundations like Liberty Hill, it's kind of a one-stop shop for Johnny Appleseeding democracy or something. I mean, we do a lot of different funding of a lot of different groups, and it's and the seeds that we plant come into fruition. Some may wither, but they grow the organizations that come on the radar screen of larger foundations or donors down the line.
Now, who else does this kind of work? I mean, I know we're LA based, and we talk about our organizations in LA, but I know that there are great centers of activism and advocacy that do this kind of work as well.
In terms of building a culture of
Well,
giving?
I know that every place there would be organizations to give to directly. There will be centers, and there are AIDS organizations, etc. But what about the foundations?
There's very few social change-oriented foundations, a network of 14 foundations across the country. Most major cities have them. The Funding Exchange, they're, Haymarket in Boston and Vanguard in San Francisco and North Star in New York, Bread and Roses in Philadelphia. There isn't one in Washington, D.C. And the women's funds, there's a network of women's funds.
And what about gay and lesbian?
And the gay and lesbian fundings, there's 20 funds housed in community foundations, and then there's some independent, Stonewall in New York, Horizons in San Francisco. There's some independent, a few
Estrella
independent foundations.
Estrella.
Estrella is
Historically
the
done,
National Lesbian Advocacy Foundation, or whatever they call themselves, foundation. There's the Legacy Fund, which raises money also for lesbian. Most of these funds are very small. They're still fairly incipient. The gay and lesbian, this moving to a culture of giving it's not new in the sense, and AIDS really galvanized it, but it's not new in the sense of a configuration of donors around individual projects, but it's new as a kind of philanthropic movement.
Right, but this becomes something we're talking about here in terms of, I think, the idea that it's easy to say to somebody, I want you to write a check for the center, or for this AIDS organization, or for this theater company. But to say to somebody, I want you to give money to this foundation, and trust them or understand that that money is then going to go to things you believe in. A lot of people, first of all, are selfish and either want the personal recognition or want the control. Well, why should I give $1,000 or $5,000 or $50,000 to a foundation when I can pick the 5 or 10 things that I'm going to write $5,000 checks to and get my name on a building or get my name here, or really, you know, serve my friends or do things that are really specifically important to me. And it becomes that sort of next step in the education for a donor to say, okay, there are foundations that can give seed grants, that can reach out to really disenfranchised groups within our own community, the fringes of a fringe community. And that help, you won't know about that organization, but your money can make a huge difference.
Or there's donor-advised accounts.
Right.
So a donor-advised account is a donor puts
ahead,
their
tell
own
them.
money into
I can
a
talk
fund
about
and
that since I've just done that with Liberty Hill, which is making a significant gift to Liberty Hill Foundation, a portion of which goes directly to Liberty Hill for their administrative expenses and running and growing the foundation, and then the money sits there under my control as the donor to work with Liberty Hill and make a grant to either an organization that I want to make a grant to, or that Liberty Hill comes to me and says, here's something we couldn't fund. They came to us with a request for money, and we didn't have money in this fund, or in our general account, so perhaps you'd like to fund this. And it's a way of educating me as a donor about organizations and issues I may not be familiar with, and also a way, obviously, which brings me sort of this article I'd found in the New York Times, which is about the Americans giving. Claude Rosenberg, who had done this great study about Americans giving money, and with appreciated stock, and that we have to educate people that you give not on what you make, but what you have. And especially, I mean, Bill Gates is the classic example. Now I think everybody in the philanthropic community would like to take him and his computer system and, push him off the Seattle Bridge, because here's a man who, with the stock market and whatever, has made more money than anybody in the history of this country, and probably proportionally gives less than almost anybody in the history of this country, and now only gives money because he's really being dragged through the mud about not giving money. But how does he give money? By giving computers, which will use Microsoft programming, to schools and to libraries. So it becomes self-serving philanthropy, which is sort of unattractive to me. but so, there's it's that whole thing. I mean, if Bill Gates were on the cover of Newsweek not because he was being sued by the Justice Department in antitrust, or not because he was the richest man in the world, but because he gave $3 billion or $10 billion to fund 100 different charitable programs across the country or whatever, I'm not even speaking eloquently about it because the amount of money is so ridiculous. How much money does one man need? And in the economy that we're in this country, there are a lot of even junior Bill Gates who are making money hand over fist that they couldn't spend in their lifetime. So it all becomes about ego. Mine is bigger, so to speak.
Well, but it's funny the way people grow up feeling either empathetic and sometimes then, or if they have a savior
Republicans
complex.
or Democrats?
Republicans
Sorry.
or Democrats. Well, we can't say that money has not been given by Republicans.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, this would not be historically accurate. And we didn't want to say, oh, well, there shouldn't be an opera. That those blue-haired ladies, among which I'll probably count myself in a very few years, made the music centers and the theaters and Disney, this and that, and that's all important too. But for our community, not that we don't need our cultural places, because the center has certainly opened an arena in which a lot of this can go on, but to me the thing that has always been ignored is really the thing you were talking about, Alice, and that Torie, you and Bill have been involved in really your whole lives, which is much more about social change work. And that is not the thing that attracts the big bucks. Government is afraid of being involved in an organization that's doing social change because they're going to fund somebody to turn around and sue us or something. A lot of fear about that. Do you find more difficulty raising money for social change kinds of things than, for saving lives? And I don't want to put that down either, but you know what I mean? It's different from services.
Yeah, but maybe it's just the circle of the networks that I work in. The majority of the people that I know, they're committed to social change. They're committed to a progressive movement. They would wholeheartedly give their money to Liberty Hill and believe in the vision. And I think earlier we talked about why people need to give to private foundations, and we talked about educating the donor base. And a lot of women give to the LA Women's Foundation because they know that it helps women and it's about women's issues. A lot of lesbians give, and bisexual women probably give to Estrella because it's about helping our own, and they're educated on the issues because they know that these issues and these organizations wouldn't get funded elsewhere. So that kind of comes back to the point that you made of we need to take care of our own. But when I hear about that, I wonder about who is this own, like how do we define the own, because who is this community that we're talking about, because so many people intersect in different ways to the gay and lesbian community, either by race or transgender, bisexual, income level, all these different things. So it's a tough decision because in some ways if you don't have all that much money, you really want to make sure your money goes somewhere that has the most impact in the way that you're committed to. And I've been with an organization that got money from Liberty Hill. So, I've kind of been on both ends, giving money out and getting money. So it's kind of a tough thing for me when I think about it. But I think everyone here has said it's about educating the donor base.
Well,
really,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, really making sure that people understand and they are invested in the mission of the foundation or the mission of the fund, so you feel good that your money is going to go and make an impact somewhere. You're not just writing a check because you want a tax deduction on your income taxes or something. I mean, that's a good byproduct, but it's not only for that.
But it's also, it becomes sort of, again, cultural. This is a new community. There have been gay and lesbian people for as long as there have been people, but that we have risen up as a community and identified ourselves to the public world is really since Stonewall in the last 30 years, that we have said, here, we are a group of people who have this in common. Now, the unfortunate or fortunate thing that makes this community so vibrant in some ways is that that's all we have in common. And there are a lot of other elements: race, socioeconomic issue, location, gender. But you go back to the blue-haired ladies who support primarily arts organizations. That has been a tradition amongst the blue-hairs of the blue-hairs mothers and the blue-hairs mothers' mothers. Well, and the Metropolitan Opera, is 100 and some years old. And so there is a culture of giving there about arts organizations and certain things in that is new to this because it's a new community. And we're still feeling our way sometimes in the most basic social political issues and trying to come up with a unified identity. So the way that we raise money within the community is I go to my friends and I say, here's the perfect, I either go to my friends and say, come to this dinner because I'm on the board, or Elizabeth Taylor is going to be there, or they're honoring Torie Osborn, or whatever. And yes, it's putting on a tuxedo, and as much as we all sort of complain, oh God, I don't want to go to another black tie event, the truth is you like it. You dress up, you go hang out with your friends, you have a cocktail, you see people, it's social. And it's easy to get somebody to write a $250, $500 check to come sit at my table, we'll have a good time. And that's why, for example, and Liberty Hill is honoring him, Dan Pallotta has been so successful with the creation of the concept of the AIDS rides, because you take people. First of all, it's a vital issue in this community, but then you get somebody who says, wait, I'm spending a week of my life on a bicycle in a tent? Now, you're going to write me a check to support me in that, or you're not my friend. And so there's a really basic personal connection to fundraising. Obviously, that's the way money is raised. You know, obviously.
I hear guilt, actually. That's how you bring people to get money.
Sometimes.
It's true. I mean, that is an impact, whether it's a personal guilt or a personal
Obligation.
sort of sense of obligation. You know, certainly direct mail and the other sort of generic non-personal methods, telemarketing stuff, raise some money, but the truth is, in any organization, most of that money is raised to get names on your donor list and to pay for itself. It's not about...
Well, and we hear love when people give us money. I mean, historically, or in a family, even a family with no money like mine, it was sort of like, well, you care for me because you're caring for me. And I think, I am totally pissed at people who won't give me money in my campaign. I mean, I don't say, oh, you're off my list.
You mean there's somebody?
No.
You mean there's somebody in America who hasn't written Sheila Kuehl a check?
I mean, I don't understand it.
But also,
you know,
Sheila,
if they believe in my work,
Sheila,
if
it's
they don't.
because you ask for
Right.
money too. And the thing is, I was just reading a study before I came over here. Study after study, it's not the only one. This happened to be a study of lesbian giving. And study after study, no matter what the group is, concludes with the huge, grandiose conclusion that most people who don't give because they're not asked.
But Torie will laugh at this because, you know, I was on the board of the center previously 7 or 8 years ago when Torie was the executive director, and now I'm back on the board and I've just rejoined the board. And from the culture of board members, and boards is the obligation that a board has nowadays to be a fundraising board in major organizations. You know, we've grown up from the board is worrying about, you know, what color the paper clips are to how are we going to raise the $25 million next year. And we still have these conversations and these trainings, and I sat at my first board meeting and there was a discussion about people of color and women, and the reality is there are those stereotypes and the perception. Money comes from where money is, and money comes because people ask. And we're scheduling our next board retreat, and a part of the board retreat is going to be devoted to fundraising role-playing. And I thought,
Deja vu.
it doesn't, you know, it becomes constantly educating. Again, it comes back to the sort of nascent state that this community is in so many ways.
Well, people don't like rejection either, and our community has experienced a lot of rejection. And
Right, so it's
you know,
absolutely-
it's hard to ask for money. People tell me, I never had this problem because I always was with 501c3s.
That as an
and I
actor,
would
you
say-
never were afraid of rejection, or you wouldn't have had the earlier career you had.
Well, I don't know if I could say I was never afraid of rejection.
Well, you were able to
I could
handle
say
it.
that I
You were
didn't
able to handle it.
kill myself when I lost a part, which is, you know, a broad way away from that. But, well, you know, because you manage artists and you know, some handle rejection well and some don't, but they stay in the business. It's the same with people, I think, who ask for money for organizations or boards. I have to say to people, okay, it may be easy for me, but I really need to get that it's not easy for you. And I say this to new candidates.
But you can learn it. I mean, you
Right.
may have learned it earlier, or it may have come more easily to you because you were an actor, and Bill may have had it modeled in his family or had friends. But I can remember going from being an activist executive director to being a fundraising executive director, and I mean, I had to practice and practice and practice. It was just like learning how to public speak. My God, it was just like learning how to ride a bicycle.
Well,
I mean, you have to practice it. Learning to ask for money is a skill. It's an art, it's a science, it's a skill, but anybody can learn it.
Right.
And as much as Torie said, you know, deja vu when I'm talking about the board, it becomes a responsibility of being on a board. And so you have to take the time to be trained, to be educated, to learn how to ask for money, to be able to say to somebody, look, I'm doing this and it's important and I need you to give this kind of money and I know you're capable of it and here's why.
And you have to take the responsibility, not just if you're staff or board or on the board of a fund, to ask for money, but I would argue that part of the social responsibility, part of helping to leave the world in a better place than when you came into it, is to become a donor. And to own that phrase, whether it's a $25 a year amount that you can give, or whether it's $25,000.
And that becomes, I think, really the core of this whole conversation, which is the idea of leaving the world a better place. There are some people who choose through public service, as a politician and an elected official, as an activist, as a donor, as a board member, as a donor, that you have, whether you've learned it, seen it, or just are it, that you have some obligation here in this short time on this little spinning thing to try to make it a little better than how you left it, and not to rape the environment and destroy the planet and step all over the people around you on the way to the top, because you're going to end up in a box no matter who you are. And
In the long run, it's a race, you end up in a tie.
you know, and so there's an educational process that hopefully can occur of and some people, you know, it's a question of personal responsibility. Some people just won't have it, won't see it, don't want to be bothered.
Well, the
Haven't tried it.
But also,
Right.
I think people like this way of participating, and goes to this question of if they just get asked. I mean, I know from nonprofit work and from political fundraising that people feel they are investing in something, and they can be asked to invest in making the world a better place simply by supporting it, because people may not have the time to show up and do a hotline or, you know, volunteer. Really may not have the time. They have,
We have
families
money
or
and we
whatever.
have time, and
We have a little
sometimes we have
money,
a lot
and you
less
say
time.
you can participate in this change. You can participate in social change, and I think people are happy to do it.
Right, I'm open to any way people can give, and if it's time, if it's money, if it's you know, material goods, if they want to give a computer to an organization, and you know, I'm not going to say no to someone who wants to give money to me unless maybe it's like Coors or something. And you know, I think that's an issue that the gay and lesbian community is grappling with too. You know, like corporations who have homophobic practices or who have done, you know, bad things in the past about race, about gays and lesbians, but gay and lesbian institutions still take their money. And I think, you know, that is, you
Sure,
know,
open
made
this can of worms 3 minutes
I know.
before the show's over.
That's made
good.
a ripple, you know, but
It's true, though.
Yeah,
It's an old moral dilemma that
Yeah.
every empowered community that needs money goes through.
I
And
know.
I think
Where
it's
do
an
you-
ongoing conversation. It ain't going to go anywhere.
No, and I mean, I think you attempt, if you're involved in an organization, hopefully you try to bring some responsibility back to the donor.
Some
and use your-
responsibility in your investment practices, some responsibility in your financial practices, and some responsibility in your fund-taking practices. I think, you know, it's interesting, there's sort of a thread that ties the three of us together, and also you, because you're on the advisory board of the Liberty Hill Foundation. And Alice is on the board of the Lesbian and Gay Community Fund of LA, which is in negotiations with Liberty Hill to become become a fund of Liberty Hill. And when I was having breakfast with my friend Billy Melamed one morning and mentioned this to him, he said, well, if the fund comes to Liberty Hill, I want to give a check for $25,000. And I didn't even ask him. He offered it. It's that kind of leadership that makes it all, you know, happen. Alice's leadership for 3 years, giving money, raising money, and doing the grant-making work. The work that I'm doing as an activist at a foundation, bringing together gay and lesbian issues with other economic and social justice issues, and the kind of leadership of an activist donor that makes it happen at a critical time, seeding a new project in a new organization, just what we were talking about.
Well, it's perfect timing because we're just about out of time, something like 30 seconds left. I think this is a really fascinating and good issue for our community, and maybe I'm wrong, but I had not really heard this really explored very much. We talk in our own circles, but it is the real, I guess, the mother's milk. That would be a sexist thing to say.
Harvey
the
milk.
lifeblood
It's the Harvey milk. It's the Harvey milk.
of our movement. And certainly you are as well. I thank you very much, Alice and Bill and Torie, for being with us. And I guess we rarely leave you with a message other than, you know, take care of yourself and do good and goodbye.
And
but
write
in
a
this
check.
case, I think it's write a check, write another check, because if you do, you can get used to it.